truth was just beginning.
April 28, 1944. Berlin. A single desk lamp cuts through the darkness of an SS intelligence office on Prince Albrechtstrasse. Major Hermann Zandl places the Decoded intercept on his desk with hands that want to tremble but cannot afford to. The document is 43 pages long. It contains troop concentrations, naval formations, airfield expansions across southern England, logistical buildups that defy comprehension. The numbers are staggering. Over 1 million men, thousands of vessels, an armada of aircraft so vast it would blot out the French sky. Every detail points to Normandy, not Pas-de-Calais, where the Führer insists the blow will fall. Normandy. Zandl has cross-referenced agent reports from Lisbon, Stockholm, and Switzerland. He has analyzed aerial reconnaissance photographs. He has studied railway schedules and fuel depot constructions. The pattern is undeniable. The Allies are preparing the largest amphibious invasion in human history, and they are aiming it at the beaches between Cherbourg and Caen. He reads the report one final time before sealing it in the dispatch folder marked Nur für den Führer, for the Führer's eyes only. Outside his window, Berlin sleeps under blackout curtains. Zandl does not know that his report will reach Hitler's desk in 72 hours. He does not know it will be dismissed as defeatist propaganda within minutes. He does not know that accurate intelligence, when it contradicts absolute certainty, becomes merely inconvenient noise. The intelligence war of 1944 was not fought with guns. It was fought with whispers, radio signals, double agents, and the careful manipulation of what the enemy believed to be true. By the spring of 1944, Nazi Germany operated multiple competing intelligence organizations, each jealous of its authority, each reporting to different masters. The Abwehr, under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, handled military intelligence. The Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, served as the Nazi Party's intelligence arm under Reinhard Heydrich and later Ernst Kaltenbrunner. The Gestapo maintained its own foreign intelligence network. The Wehrmacht's intelligence branches operated independently within each service. This fragmentation was not accidental. Hitler distrusted unified intelligence structures. He preferred competing agencies that would check each other's power, report conflicting assessments, and allow him to choose whichever version of reality suited his strategic vision. The result was chaos dressed as thoroughness. By 1943, the Abwehr had been compromised so thoroughly by Allied intelligence that nearly every agent it controlled in Britain was actually working for MI5. The famous double-cross system had turned German espionage into a British ventriloquist act. Every message sent back to Berlin was crafted in a basement office in London, designed not to inform, but to deceive. The SD knew this. Internal reports from SS intelligence analysts warned repeatedly that Abwehr networks in England were unreliable, possibly compromised, feeding information that was too convenient and too consistent to be genuine. But Admiral Canaris remained protected by his relationship with senior Wehrmacht officers, and Hitler refused to dismantle an organization that told him Britain was weaker than it appeared. The intelligence reaching German headquarters in early 1944 was therefore a mixture of three parts: accurate observations from air reconnaissance and neutral country sources, fabricated reports from turned agents, and wishful interpretations from analysts who understood that pessimistic assessments damaged careers. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Allies were orchestrating the most elaborate deception operation in military history. Operation Fortitude was not a single lie but a symphony of lies, each reinforcing the others. Fortitude North suggested an invasion of Norway, complete with fake radio traffic from Scottish bases and a non-existent British Fourth Army. Fortitude South created an entire phantom force, the first United States Army group supposedly commanded by General George Patton, massing in southeastern England for an assault on Pas-de-Calais. The deception involved physical props, inflatable tanks parked in fields, plywood landing craft floating in harbors, fake oil storage facilities that gleamed convincingly from the air. It involved electronic warfare, radio operators transmitting the communications patterns of divisions that did not exist. It involved controlled leaks through diplomatic channels and carefully scripted prisoner interrogations. Most crucially, it involved double agents. Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Agent Garbo by the British and Alaric by the Germans, had convinced the Abwehr he commanded a network of 27 sub-agents across Britain. In reality, every single one was fictional. Garbo's reports were masterpieces of plausible fabrication, detailed, slightly flawed to seem authentic, and strategically timed to reinforce German preconceptions. The Germans paid him in pounds sterling and awarded him the Iron Cross. He was working for MI5 the entire time. By April 1944, German intelligence had collected thousands of data points about Allied invasion preparations. Air reconnaissance showed construction activity. Signals intelligence tracked increased radio traffic. Agent reports described troop movements. Neutral diplomats repeated overheard conversations. The question was not whether an invasion was coming. The question was where. And on this question, German intelligence found itself staring at two contradictory pictures. The fabricated evidence pointed overwhelmingly to Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing point, the most logical target, the route that would lead most directly to the Ruhr industrial heartland. The physical evidence, aerial photographs of port facilities, actual troop concentrations, supply depot construction, suggested something different. It suggested Normandy. Lower-level intelligence officers noticed the discrepancy. Reports began filtering upward through the SS intelligence hierarchy, carefully worded, backed by photographic evidence and logistical analysis. These reports noted the expansion of ports in southwestern England. They documented the construction of artificial harbor components. They tracked fuel pipeline materials being stockpiled near embarkation points that made no sense for a Calais assault. The analysts were doing their jobs. The system, however, was designed to filter truth through ideology. Adolf Hitler had built an empire on intuition. He believed, genuinely, unshakably, that his instincts surpassed the careful analysis of trained professionals. He had been proven right before. In 1936, he remilitarized the Rhineland against the advice of his generals. In 1938, he absorbed Austria while his military staff warned of catastrophe. In 1940, he approved the Ardennes offensive that every professional officer said was impossible. Each success reinforced his certainty that he possessed a strategic vision denied to lesser men. By 1944, this conviction had calcified into something more dangerous than confidence. It had become immunity to contradiction. Hitler's relationship with intelligence services reflected this worldview. He did not want information that challenged his assumptions. He wanted confirmation of what he already knew to be true. Intelligence officers learned quickly that delivering unwelcome news was a career-ending gesture, sometimes a life-ending one. The Führer had decided, in late 1943, that the Allied invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. The logic was impeccable from his perspective. Calais offered the shortest sea crossing, 21 miles versus over 100 to Normandy. It would allow the Allies to establish fighter cover from English bases. It pointed directly toward Belgium and the Ruhr, Germany's industrial core. An attack anywhere else would be strategically wasteful, and Hitler did not believe his enemies were fools. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed to inspect Atlantic Wall defenses in late 1943, was less certain. Rommel walked the beaches of Normandy in December 1943 and January 1944. He studied the coastline with the eye of a man who understood amphibious warfare's brutal mathematics. The beaches were wide, the gradient shallow enough for landing craft, the inland terrain suitable for rapid advance once the coastal defenses were breached. He ordered massive defensive construction, millions of mines, thousands of obstacles in the tidal zone, reinforced strongpoints covering every likely landing area. He did not do this because he had read intelligence reports pointing to Normandy. He did it because the beaches made military sense. But Rommel reported to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, who believed the decisive battle should be fought inland after the Allies established their beachhead. Both men reported to Hitler, who believed the main attack would come at Calais regardless of what either field marshal thought. This command structure guaranteed paralysis. The 15th Army, Germany's strongest formation in France with 19 divisions, remained concentrated around Pas-de-Calais throughout the spring of 1944. The 7th Army defended Normandy with only 10 divisions, several of them static formations composed of overage troops or Eastern Front casualties recovering from wounds. The Panzer Reserves, Germany's mobile striking force, were scattered across France under a command arrangement so convoluted It required Hitler's personal authorization to move them in combat. This was not stupidity. This was the inevitable result of a dictatorship where military decisions flowed from political ideology rather than tactical reality. Into this environment came the intelligence reports that would later be called prophetic. The first significant warnings arrived in March 1944. An SD analysis of Allied shipping movements noted unusual concentrations in southwest English ports: Southampton, Portland, Weymouth. These were not the embarkation points one would use for a Calais assault. A separate report from air reconnaissance documented the construction of what appeared to be components for artificial harbors, a technology that made sense only if the Allies intended to assault a coastline without existing port facilities. Normandy had no major ports between Cherbourg and Le Havre. Calais had port facilities that could handle immediate logistics. The analysis seemed obvious. In April, a more comprehensive assessment reached Berlin from SS intelligence sources. This report, later attributed to officers within the SD's Foreign Intelligence Section, compiled evidence from multiple streams. It noted the positioning of specific Allied divisions identified through signals intelligence. It analyzed the types of landing craft being concentrated in southern England. It calculated the fuel and ammunition stockpiles being established near embarkation points. Every calculation pointed to an assault on Normandy, likely between the Cotentin Peninsula and the Orne River. The report estimated invasion timing, late May or early June, depending on tidal and weather conditions. It provided specific beach sectors where landings appeared most probable. It was approximately 90% accurate. The response from Hitler's headquarters was swift and unequivocal. The report represented defeatist thinking influenced by enemy propaganda. The Führer's strategic assessment remained unchanged. Pas-de-Calais was the obvious target. Any suggestion otherwise indicated either incompetence or disloyalty. The intelligence officers who authored the report were not punished, not immediately. They were simply ignored. Their analysis was filed away, marked as representing a minority viewpoint, noted for the record, but given no operational weight. The 15th Army remained at Calais. The Panzer Reserves stayed scattered. Rommel continued building obstacles on Normandy beaches that higher command did not believe would ever be tested. And across the Channel, Allied planners watched German dispositions through ultra-intercepts and reconnaissance, increasingly confident that their deception was working beyond their most optimistic projections. The Germans were not failing to gather intelligence. They were failing to believe it. Major Hermann Sandel was not alone in his assessment. Across the German intelligence apparatus, analysts with access to raw data were reaching similar conclusions. These were not defeatists or saboteurs. They were career officers trained in the methodical evaluation of evidence, men who understood that their job was to report reality, not to validate their superiors' preferences. Colonel Alexis Baron von Rohen headed Foreign Armies West, the Wehrmacht intelligence section responsible for evaluating Allied capabilities in Britain. Von Rohen was an aristocrat from the old Prussian military tradition, a professional who believed intelligence work required dispassionate honesty. Through the spring of 1944, his section produced estimates of Allied strength that were remarkably accurate, sometimes underestimating by 10%, sometimes overestimating slightly, but consistently within the range of rational analysis. His reports noted the buildup in southwestern England. They were revised upward in April to reflect what aerial reconnaissance actually showed. Von Rohen understood he was walking a professional tightrope. Report Allied strength too accurately, and he would be accused of defeatism. Underestimate it, and German forces would be catastrophically unprepared when the invasion came. He chose accuracy, believing that even Hitler would respect facts when the moment arrived. He was wrong. In the SD's Foreign Intelligence Branch, younger officers with fresher training noticed patterns their superiors missed. They had studied Allied logistics doctrines. They understood that massive amphibious operations required specific types of preparation: fuel pipelines, artificial harbors, specialized landing craft configurations. When these signatures appeared in southwestern England, rather than the southeast, the implications seemed obvious. One report circulated internally in late April used stark language. Enemy preparations are inconsistent with an assault on Pas-de-Calais. Observable indicators suggest primary landing areas between Cherbourg and Caen, with possible secondary landings in Brittany. The report was correct about Normandy. It was wrong about Brittany, a phantom exactly as Allied deception planners intended. But its core assessment was sound. The officer who wrote it watched his analysis climb the chain of command, each level adding qualifying language, softening conclusions, appending notes about alternative interpretations. By the time it reached Kaltenbrunner's office, the report had been transformed from a clear warning into a catalog of possibilities, with Normandy listed as one option among several. This was how truth died in authoritarian systems, not through direct suppression, but through bureaucratic dilution. These intelligence officers lived with the knowledge that their work was being systematically ignored. They saw accurate assessments dismissed while fabricated reports from compromised agents were given credence. They watched as strategic decisions were made based on the Führer's intuition rather than their careful analysis. Some stayed silent, believing orders were orders. Some tried again, rewording their conclusions, searching for phrasing that might penetrate the ideological barriers. None succeeded. By late May, when the final warning should have triggered maximum alert, the intelligence community had learned helplessness. They continued filing reports because that was their function, but they no longer expected those reports to influence decisions. The system had trained them that truth was not valued if it contradicted power. German intelligence gathering in 1944 operated through multiple overlapping systems, each with distinct capabilities and limitations. Aerial reconnaissance provided the most reliable data. Luftwaffe reconnaissance units flew high-altitude missions over southern England, photographing ports, airfields, and troop concentrations. The images were clear enough to count ships in harbors and identify aircraft types on runways. Photo interpreters worked in shifts, marking changes between successive flights, tracking construction progress, mapping the expansion of military infrastructure. These photographs did not lie. They showed exactly what was happening in England. A massive military buildup concentrated in two primary areas, the southeast around Dover and Kent, and the southwest around Southampton and Portsmouth. The southeast concentration was almost entirely fictional. Inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft, dummy installations designed to be photographed. The southwest concentration was real, actual divisions, real landing craft, genuine supply depots preparing for genuine invasion. German photo interpreters could not distinguish between the two. They reported both buildups as equally significant, which meant the fabricated evidence at Calais received equal weight with the actual preparations for Normandy. Signals intelligence, radio intercepts, and traffic analysis provided another stream of information. German listening posts tracked Allied radio transmissions, noting unit call signs, message volumes, and communication patterns. Experienced signals analysts could identify divisions by their radio signatures and track their movements across England. The Allies knew this. Operation Fortitude included elaborate radio deception. Phantom divisions transmitted exactly the message traffic real divisions would generate. The fictional 1st United States Army Group under Patton maintained a signals profile consistent with a force of 40 divisions preparing for imminent deployment. German signals intelligence reported what it heard. Massive concentrations in southeastern England. Communications patterns suggesting Patton commanded the primary invasion force. Radio traffic indicating assault preparations focused on the Calais sector. Every bit of it was theater. The double agents provided the third stream, human intelligence from sources supposedly operating inside Britain. Agent Garbo, Agent Brutus, Agent Treasure, and dozens of others filed regular reports describing what they observed. They reported troop movements, overheard conversations, documents glimpsed in officers' briefcases. The Abwehr trusted these agents because they had been reliable for years, their information often verified by other sources, not realizing that other sources were additional double agents creating circular confirmation. When Garbo reported in May that Patton's army group was preparing to assault Calais, the Abwehr filed it as Category A intelligence, highest reliability. The report was written by a British intelligence officer in London. German intelligence analysts faced an impossible puzzle. They had three information streams that contradicted each other in subtle but significant ways. Aerial reconnaissance showed buildups in two areas. Signals intelligence suggested Calais as primary target. Agent reports confirmed Patois as the main threat. The physical evidence, actual observation of real things, pointed increasingly toward Normandy. The human intelligence, reports from trusted agents, pointed overwhelmingly toward Calais. Professional intelligence work required weighing sources, assessing reliability, cross-referencing claims against known facts. But in Nazi Germany, professional intelligence work also required understanding which conclusions were politically acceptable. Normandy was not acceptable. Therefore, the evidence for Normandy was reinterpreted, minimized, or dismissed as deception. Hitler's morning briefings followed a predictable pattern by 1944. Military advisors arrived with maps, intelligence summaries, and operational recommendations. They presented information organized by theater: the Eastern Front, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic Wall, the bomber war over Germany. Each briefing officer understood that his role was not merely to inform, but to navigate, to deliver news in ways that would not trigger the Führer's rage or dismissal. When intelligence about Normandy reached these briefings, it arrived embedded in larger assessments about Allied invasion preparations. The information was there, documented, supported by evidence, but it was presented as one possibility among several, always with the qualifier that Pas-de-Calais remained the most likely target based on strategic logic. Hitler seized on the qualifiers and ignored the evidence. His response to warnings about Normandy followed a consistent script. He would dismiss the suggestion as Allied deception, designed to draw German forces away from the real target at Calais. He would cite the distances involved. Why would the Allies choose a longer sea crossing when a shorter one was available? He would invoke strategic logic. The Ruhr was the obvious objective, and Calais was the direct route to the Ruhr. His arguments were not irrational. They were simply incomplete, based on what the Allies should do rather than what intelligence indicated they were doing. When subordinates pressed the issue, Hitler's responses escalated. He would accuse them of defeatism, of allowing Allied propaganda to cloud their judgment, of lacking the willpower to see through enemy deception. In extreme cases, he would question their loyalty to the Reich. This was not paranoia. It was a deliberate management technique. By treating unwelcome intelligence as evidence of disloyalty, Hitler ensured that future briefings would filter such information before it reached him. Officers learned that bringing bad news or challenging the Führer's assessments was professionally suicidal. The smart approach was to present information that confirmed existing beliefs, or at minimum, to frame contradictory evidence in ways that allowed Hitler to dismiss it without making the briefing officer responsible for the contradiction. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's closest military advisors, had perfected this dynamic. They functioned less as independent strategic thinkers than as translators, converting Hitler's impulses into military orders and filtering field reports into forms that would not provoke outbursts. When Rommel requested permission to move panzer reserves closer to the Normandy coast in May 1944, his request traveled through this system. Keitel and Jodl understood that Hitler believed Calais was the target, and that the panzers should remain positioned for a mobile counterattack anywhere along the coast. Rommel's request implied that Hitler's strategic assessment was wrong. The request was denied, not through direct confrontation, but through bureaucratic delay and reframing. The panzers remained under OKW control, Hitler's personal command, rather than being released to field commanders who might move them based on local tactical assessments. This created a military structure where accurate intelligence could not generate appropriate responses, even when that intelligence reached decision-makers. The system was designed to protect Hitler's strategic vision from contradiction, which meant it was designed to fail when reality contradicted that vision. Junior officers understood this perfectly. They saw their reports climb the chain of command and disappear into a void. They watched as their analyses were revised, softened, qualified into meaninglessness. Some became cynical, continuing to file reports because regulations required it, but abandoning any hope their work would matter. Others convinced themselves that perhaps higher headquarters possessed information they lacked, context that explained why obvious conclusions were being ignored. A few simply despaired. One intelligence officer, in a letter to a colleague later discovered by Allied forces, wrote in May 1944, We are asked to provide information but not truth. The distinction, I fear, will cost us everything. He was not wrong. The planners of Operation Fortitude understood a fundamental principle of deception. People believe what confirms their existing assumptions. The operation did not need to convince Germany that Calais was the target. Germany had already convinced itself. Fortitude simply needed to reinforce that conviction with enough fabricated evidence that German intelligence would find what it expected to find and dismiss anything contradictory as anomalous or deceptive. The operation worked because it was layered. At the physical level, entire fake divisions occupied southeastern England. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, existed only as props and radio signals, but from the air it looked like 40 divisions preparing for deployment. Inflatable tanks were positioned in fields where German reconnaissance would photograph them. Dummy landing craft bobbed in harbors. Fake fuel depots were constructed with enough detail to seem operational under aerial observation. At the electronic level, radio operators transmitted the communication patterns of a massive military force. They used proper call signs, maintained realistic message traffic, created the signal signature of divisions conducting pre-invasion training. German signals intelligence dutifully recorded these transmissions and reported them as evidence of Allied strength in southeastern England. At the human intelligence level, double agents filed reports that wove physical and electronic deception into a coherent narrative. Garbo reported that Patton commanded FUSAG. Brutus described seeing American insignia in Kent. Treasure overheard conversations about assault preparations targeting Calais. Each source confirmed the others. The deception was so thorough that even when German intelligence received accurate information about Normandy, it interpreted that information as part of the deception. If the Allies wanted to attack Calais, of course they would create false indicators suggesting Normandy. The presence of preparations in southwestern England therefore became, in German analysis, evidence that Calais was the real target. This was not stupidity. This was confirmation bias operating at strategic scale. Allied planners monitored German reactions through Ultra, the decryption of German Enigma communications. They could read Wehrmacht intelligence assessments almost as quickly as German commanders received them. When those assessments showed that German forces remained concentrated at Calais, Allied planners knew their deception was working. They adjusted their approach in real time, feeding additional false information through double agents whenever German attention seemed to drift toward Normandy. The system was self-reinforcing. Every German decision based on false intelligence created new opportunities for deception. Every panzer division that remained at Calais validated Allied confidence that their invasion would face weaker opposition in Normandy. By late May, as D-Day approached, German intelligence had created an entirely fictional order of battle for Allied forces in Britain. They believed the Allies had 89 divisions in England, when the actual number was 47. They placed fictional divisions in positions where actual divisions were not. They assigned Patton to command an army group that did not exist. The supreme irony was that German intelligence had also collected accurate information. Aerial photographs of real preparations existed in the files. Signals intelligence had tracked actual divisions moving to southwestern embarkation ports. Even some agent reports contained truthful details mixed with fabrication. But the accurate information was buried in a mountain of false data specifically designed to make it seem like the anomaly rather than the pattern. When the invasion came, it would not surprise German intelligence because they lacked information. It would surprise them because they believed the wrong information. May 28, 1944. The final comprehensive intelligence assessment arrived on Hitler's desk through channels that bypassed normal military command structures. It came from SD Foreign Intelligence, marked with the highest classification, compiled by officers who understood this would likely be their last opportunity to warn the Führer before the invasion materialized. The report was 37 pages long. It began with a summary that left no room for ambiguity. All available evidence indicates the primary Allied invasion will strike the Normandy coast between Cherbourg and Caen. Secondary operations may occur in Brittany. Timing is estimated between June 1st and June 10th, dependent on tidal and weather conditions. The body of the report methodically dismantled the case for Calais. It noted that aerial reconnaissance showed substantially heavier construction activity in southwestern English ports than in southeastern facilities. Southampton, Portsmouth, and Portland had expanded their berthing capacity by 300% since January. Dover and Folkestone showed minimal expansion despite supposedly preparing for the main invasion force. Fuel pipeline construction pointed toward southwestern embarkation points. The Allies were building underwater pipeline capacity, Operation Pluto, with feeder lines terminating at ports aligned with a Normandy approach, not a Calais crossing. Landing craft concentrations told the same story. Photo interpreters had identified and catalogued over 4,000 vessels in southern England. The majority, approximately 60%, were concentrated in the southwest. These were not evenly distributed, which they would be if Calais were the target and southwestern concentrations merely a feint. The distribution suggested operational reality, not deception. The report included an analysis of artificial harbor components observed under construction. These massive concrete structures, photographed at multiple locations, made strategic sense only if the Allies intended to assault a coastline without existing port facilities. Calais had ports. Normandy's coast between Cherbourg and Caen had beaches but no deep-water harbors. Why build artificial harbors for an invasion that would immediately capture existing ports? The question answered itself. Signals intelligence data filled 8 pages. The report acknowledged that radio traffic suggested large forces in southeastern England, but noted inconsistencies. Message volume was high, but too regular, too predictable. Real military formations generated irregular traffic patterns, sudden surges during exercises, quiet periods during movement, bursts of activity during planning. The southeastern signals showed none of this variation. They looked like theater. The report's most damning section addressed agent reports from Britain. Here, the SD analysts did something unprecedented. They challenged the Abwehr's human intelligence. The report noted that agents in Britain provided remarkably consistent information, all confirming Calais as the target. It observed that this consistency itself was suspicious. Real agents operating independently would show variation in their access, contradictions in their reporting, occasional errors in detail. The British agents showed none of this. Their reports were too good, too confirmatory, too aligned with what Berlin wanted to hear. The SD stopped short of explicitly stating the Abwehr network was compromised, but the implication filled the pages like smoke. Reliability of human intelligence from Britain must be reassessed, the report stated. Consistency across sources may indicate coordination rather than independent verification. In other words, the agents were controlled. The final section provided specific predictions. The invasion would come in early June, probably between the 5th and 7th, when tidal conditions would be optimal for landing craft approaching beaches exposed at low tide. The assault would hit 5 or 6 beach sectors simultaneously, likely spanning a 50-mile front. Airborne operations would precede the beach landings, targeting road junctions and bridges to disrupt German reinforcement. The report estimated Allied strength at the assault, 8 to 10 divisions in the first wave, with build-up capacity to land 30 divisions in the first week. It recommended immediate redeployment of the 15th Army's mobile reserves toward Normandy. It recommended releasing panzer divisions to field commanders who could position them for rapid counterattack against beach landings. It recommended maximum alert for all forces in Normandy beginning June 1st. The recommendations were sound, tactically precise, operationally urgent. Hitler read the report on May 30th. His response was recorded by multiple witnesses at the daily military briefing. He tossed the document onto the conference table and turned to Jodl with barely controlled contempt. "This is exactly what the enemy wants us to believe," he said. "They want us to weaken Calais by chasing phantom invasions in Normandy. The shortest distance between 2 points is still a straight line, gentlemen. The English Channel is narrowest at Calais. That is where they will come." An adjutant, there are conflicting accounts of who, attempted to reference the aerial reconnaissance evidence. Hitler cut him off. "Reconnaissance can be deceived. The enemy knows we photograph their preparations. They show us what they want us to see. Did none of you learn anything from our own deception operations in Poland and France? We made the enemy look where we wanted them to look while we struck elsewhere. Now they attempt the same trick, and you fall for it like academy cadets." Jodl suggested that perhaps increased vigilance in Normandy would be prudent even if Calais remained the primary focus. Hitler's response was withering. Vigilance, yes. Panic redeployment based on enemy propaganda, no. The 15th Army stays at Calais. The Panzer reserves remain under central control so they can strike wherever the real invasion appears. I will not strip our strongest defenses because intelligence officers have lost their nerve. The meeting moved on to other topics. The report was filed. No redeployments were ordered. No alerts were raised. The predictions, accurate within 48 hours on timing, precise on location, correct on tactics, generated no operational response. In Normandy, Rommel continued his defensive preparations, but without the reinforcements he had requested. The 21st Panzer Division sat near Caen, the only armored unit within immediate striking distance of the beaches. The 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr Division remained in reserve positions requiring Hitler's personal authorization to deploy. The 15th Army's 19 divisions stayed at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. On June 1st, German meteorologists reported that weather conditions in the Channel would deteriorate by June 5th, with storms making amphibious operations impossible for at least 2 weeks. This assessment reached commanders throughout the Atlantic Wall. Rommel, believing the invasion could not occur during the poor weather window, departed Normandy on June 4th to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday. He planned to continue to Berlin to personally request reinforcements from Hitler. He left behind a defensive network that was strong but not reinforced, alert but not mobilized, prepared but not positioned for the blow that intelligence had predicted with remarkable accuracy. June 5, 1944. Evening. Allied meteorologists had identified a narrow window, 36 hours of marginally acceptable weather between two storm systems. General Dwight Eisenhower made the decision at 04:15 hours that morning. The invasion would proceed on June 6th. At 2300 hours on June 5th, the first aircraft carrying British and American paratroopers lifted off from English airfields. By midnight, over 13,000 airborne troops were in the air, crossing the Channel toward drop zones in Normandy. German coastal radar detected unusual aircraft activity shortly after midnight. Reports reached 7th Army headquarters noting increased air traffic, possible paratrooper operations, scattered reports of troops landing in the Cottontown Peninsula and east of the Orne River. The duty officer at 7th Army headquarters assessed the situation as minor harassment, possibly small-scale sabotage teams, perhaps a diversion preceding the real invasion at Calais. He did not order a general alert. At 1:30 hours, French resistance networks across Normandy received coded messages broadcast by BBC Radio. Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne, the long sobs of autumn's violins. German intelligence had previously intercepted and decoded these transmission patterns. They knew these phrases signaled imminent invasion. Multiple listening posts reported the broadcasts up their chains of command. The information reached 15th Army headquarters at Calais by 0200 hours. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding 15th Army, immediately placed his forces on maximum alert. 19 divisions snapped to full readiness, manning defensive positions, preparing for the assault they had expected for months, at Calais, 300 miles from where the actual invasion was unfolding. At 7th Army headquarters in Normandy, the same BBC intercepts arrived with similar urgency. But 7th Army's commander, Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, faced a different decision. His forces were already responding to scattered paratrooper landings. Were these landings the invasion, or were they a diversion preceding the main assault elsewhere? The intelligence assessment that had predicted this exact scenario, airborne operations in Normandy, beach landings at dawn, sat in a file cabinet in Berlin, dismissed as defeatist analysis. Dollmann ordered increased alertness but stopped short of full mobilization. He requested permission to move the Panzer reserves. That permission required authorization from OKW, from Hitler's headquarters, and Hitler was asleep. The standing orders were explicit. Do not wake the Führer for anything less than confirmed large-scale invasion. Paratrooper drops did not qualify. They might be a feint. They might be commando raids. Hitler had made clear that he would personally authorize any major redeployment of armored reserves, and his staff knew better than to wake him based on incomplete information. At 0300 hours, minesweepers began clearing approach lanes to the Normandy beaches. At 0500 hours, the largest naval armada in human history, nearly 7,000 vessels, approached the French coast under darkness. At 0550 hours, naval guns opened fire, bombardment so intense it registered on seismographs in Britain. At 0630 hours, American troops landed on Utah and Omaha beaches. At 0725 hours, British and Canadian forces hit Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The invasion Hitler had been told was impossible. At Normandy was happening exactly as intelligence had predicted. Reports flooded into German headquarters with escalating urgency. Initial messages described paratrooper landings. Then came reports of glider troops seizing bridges. Then naval bombardment along a 50-mile front. Then landing craft by the hundreds approaching 5 separate beach sectors simultaneously. At 0630 hours, an aide finally woke Hitler at the Berghof with news that large-scale landings were occurring in Normandy. Hitler's first response was relief. He believed the Allied deception had finally revealed itself. They had committed to Normandy, a secondary operation surely, which meant the main invasion at Calais was still coming. The Normandy landings were the feint everyone had warned about. The 15th Army must remain at Calais to face the real threat when it materialized. He refused to release the panzer reserves. Field commanders in Normandy were frantic. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Caen, could reach the beaches within hours if authorized to move immediately. The 12th SS Panzer Division could deploy by afternoon. Panzer Lehr could arrive by evening. 3 armored divisions hitting the beaches while Allied forces were still establishing their foothold might crush the invasion before it consolidated. But those divisions could not move without Hitler's authorization, and Hitler believed Normandy was a diversion. At 0900 hours, Rommel was located at his home in Germany. He immediately began the journey back to Normandy, a trip that would take over 10 hours by automobile. At 1000 hours, Hitler convened a situation conference. His intelligence staff presented the evidence. 5 beach sectors under assault, massive naval support, airborne operations inland. Reports suggesting over 100,000 troops were landing or had already landed. Hitler remained unconvinced. He cited the intelligence reports he trusted, the reports from double agents, the reports confirming Patton commanded the main force still waiting in England, the reports indicating Calais as the primary target. Normandy was larger than expected, yes, but it was still the diversion. The real blow would fall at Calais within days, perhaps hours. He released 1 Panzer Division to Normandy, the 12th SS. He ordered the others to remain in reserve. The 15th Army, 19 divisions strong, stayed at Calais, waiting for an invasion that existed only in fabricated intelligence reports and Hitler's certainty. By 1600 hours, Allied forces had landed over 150,000 men on Normandy beaches. They had secured all 5 landing zones. Casualties were heavy, particularly at Omaha Beach, where American troops faced murderous fire. But the lodgment held. The moment for an overwhelming armored counterattack had passed. The 21st Panzer Division finally received authorization to attack late in the afternoon. It launched a thrust toward Sword Beach at 1600 hours and was met by British forces who had spent the day digging in and positioning anti-tank guns. The counterattack was repulsed with heavy losses. The 12th SS Panzer Division, delayed by authorization procedures and then by Allied air superiority that made daytime movement suicidal, did not reach the combat zone until June 7th. By then, the Allies had landed over 350,000 men. The intelligence officers who had warned about Normandy, who had provided accurate predictions on timing, location, and tactics, watched the disaster unfold exactly as they had foreseen. Their reports had been correct. Their warnings had been dismissed. And the largest amphibious invasion in history succeeded in part because Germany's leadership had chosen certainty over evidence, ideology over intelligence, and intuition over analysis. The officers who knew the truth could only watch as the beaches they had identified filled with Allied soldiers whose arrival should have surprised no one. June 6, 1944. Dusk. The beaches of Normandy smoldered under a sky still thick with aircraft. By nightfall, Allied forces had established a continuous lodgment along 50 miles of French coastline. The numbers were staggering. 156,000 men ashore, supported by over 7,000 vessels offshore, covered by 11,000 aircraft, that had flown 14,000 sorties throughout the day. German casualties in the coastal divisions defending Normandy exceeded 50% in some sectors. Entire battalions had been obliterated by naval gunfire before they could meaningfully engage the landing forces. Communication lines had been severed by airborne operations. Reserves that should have counterattacked at dawn were still awaiting authorization to move at sunset. The failure was not tactical. It was systemic. At Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere cycled between denial and rage. The Führer continued insisting that Normandy was a diversion, that Patton's army group remained in England, preparing to strike Calais once German reserves had been drawn away to Normandy. He ordered the 15th Army to maintain maximum readiness, forbade any weakening of Calais defenses, and authorized only minimal reinforcement to Normandy. Intelligence reports that might have corrected this assessment were now viewed with even deeper suspicion. If the enemy had successfully deceived Germany about the invasion timing and location, then any current intelligence might also be fabricated. Hitler's distrust of his intelligence services, already profound, calcified into complete dismissal. The officers who had warned about Normandy found themselves in an impossible position. They had been proven correct by events, but acknowledgement of their accuracy would require Hitler to admit his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. In Nazi Germany's political structure, such admissions were impossible. Instead, the narrative shifted. The story became that Germany had known about Normandy all along, but had correctly assessed it as a secondary operation. The defenses had performed as expected, making the Allies pay heavily for every meter of beach. The real test would come when Patton's forces landed at Calais and faced the full strength of the 15th Army. This fiction maintained Hitler's infallibility while explaining why German forces had not been positioned to stop the invasion. It also guaranteed continued strategic paralysis. For 3 critical days after D-Day, German reinforcements trickled toward Normandy at a rate far below what was needed to contain the Allied lodgment. Panzer divisions moved under constant air attack, forced to travel at night, losing tanks to mechanical breakdowns and fighter-bomber strikes. Infantry divisions marched hundreds of miles on foot, arriving exhausted and piecemeal. The 15th Army's powerful formations remained at Calais, immobilized by a threat that did not exist. By June 9th, Allied forces had linked their 5 beach sectors into a continuous front and begun pushing inland. The beachhead was 20 miles deep in some areas, secure enough that follow-on divisions were landing directly onto the beaches without facing significant resistance at the waterline. The moment when an armored counterattack might have driven the Allies back into the sea had passed forever. Rommel returned to Normandy on June 6th, driving through the night to reach his headquarters. He spent June 7th touring the front lines, assessing damage, attempting to organize a coherent defense with forces that had been shattered by the initial assault and the delayed response. His frustration was evident in communications with higher command. He requested immediate release of all available panzer divisions. He argued that containing the beachhead required overwhelming force applied immediately, not gradual reinforcement dribbled in under Allied air supremacy. His requests were denied or delayed. The panzer divisions would be released, eventually, but not in the concentrated mass needed for a decisive counterattack. Instead, they were committed piecemeal, one division at a time, fed into a battle that consumed them without generating the overwhelming force necessary to break the Allied lodgment. On June 10th, Hitler finally authorized movement of additional armored reserves toward Normandy. But he still refused to denude Calais. The 15th Army remained largely intact, defending against an invasion that Allied planners had no intention of launching. The intelligence failure's cost could be measured in divisions. 3 panzer divisions positioned for immediate counterattack on D-Day might have changed the battle's outcome. 6 panzer divisions committed in the first week could have seriously threatened the Allied beachhead. The 19 divisions of the 15th Army, if redeployed to Normandy in May as intelligence had recommended, would have created defensive depth that might have made the invasion impossible. Instead, German strength was dispersed across France, concentrated in the wrong locations, committed piecemeal against an enemy who had achieved overwhelming local superiority precisely because German intelligence assessments had been ignored. The officers who had written the accurate predictions watched this unfold with a mixture of vindication and horror. They had been right, but being right in Nazi Germany carried its own dangers. To have predicted disaster accurately meant having advocated for measures Hitler rejected. In the paranoid logic of totalitarian politics, accurate prediction of disaster could be reframed as defeatism or even sabotage. Some intelligence officers quietly removed their names from reports filed in May. Others prepared careful documentation, showing they had raised warnings through proper channels, hoping this would shield them from future blame. A few simply waited for the inevitable scapegoating. By mid-June, as Allied forces broke out from the beachhead and began the campaign to liberate France, the intelligence failure's full dimensions became impossible to hide. The invasion had occurred exactly where lower-level analysts said it would, exactly when they predicted, using precisely the tactics they had described. And German forces had been positioned to defend against an invasion that never came, based on intelligence that had been fabricated by the enemy, and believed because it confirmed what Hitler wanted to hear. In late June, as Allied forces captured Cherbourg and expanded the beachhead to encompass nearly 1 million men, the Abwehr's credibility collapsed entirely. Evidence mounted that its British agent network had been thoroughly compromised. Reports from agents who claimed to observe Patton's Phantom Army Group were contradicted by the reality that no second invasion materialized at Calais. By July, even Hitler could no longer sustain the fiction that Calais remained the primary target. The 15th Army finally received orders to begin redeployment toward Normandy, 6 weeks too late. The divisions that could have counterattacked on D-Day now marched toward a battle already lost, arriving exhausted to face an enemy who had secured complete air superiority and established overwhelming material advantage. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, had already been removed from his position in February 1944, following unrelated suspicions of disloyalty. The D-Day intelligence failure sealed the organization's fate. In May 1944, Hitler had ordered the Abwehr absorbed into the SD under SS control. By summer, the absorption was complete. The Wehrmacht's independent intelligence service had been dismantled, its functions transferred to Heinrich Himmler's security apparatus. Canaris himself would be arrested in July following the failed assassination attempt against Hitler. He was executed in April 1945, hanged at Flossenburg concentration camp in the war's final weeks. Whether his death related more to suspected involvement in resistance activities or to the Abwehr's intelligence failures remains debated by historians. In Nazi Germany, the distinction hardly mattered. Failure and disloyalty were treated as equivalent crimes. The intelligence officers who had correctly predicted Normandy received no recognition. Several were quietly reassigned to less sensitive positions, their accurate analyses retroactively viewed as evidence of defeatist tendencies. The SD conducted internal reviews of the May intelligence assessments, not to understand why accurate information had been dismissed, but to identify which analysts had shown insufficient confidence in German victory. This was the final perversity. Correct analysis became evidence of disloyalty. Major Hermann Sandel, whose April report had predicted Normandy with remarkable precision, was transferred to the Eastern Front in July. His service record noted that while his analytical skills were adequate, his assessments showed concerning pessimism about German capabilities. He survived the war and lived quietly in West Germany until his death in 1973, rarely speaking about his intelligence work. Colonel Alexis Baron von Roeni, who had headed foreign armies west and consistently provided accurate assessments of Allied strength, was arrested following the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. Von Roeni had maintained peripheral contact with resistance circles, though his involvement in the plot itself remains unclear. He was executed on October 12, 1944, hanged with piano wire at Plötzensee prison. His crime was not intelligence failure. His estimates had been accurate. His crime was association with officers who had attempted to kill the Führer. But his accurate intelligence work, which had contradicted Hitler's assumptions, likely contributed to suspicions about his loyalty. The broader German intelligence community learned the lesson. Accuracy that contradicts authority is more dangerous than comfortable falsehood. For the Allied intelligence services, D-Day's success represented vindication of the most elaborate deception operation ever conducted. Operation Fortitude had worked beyond the planners' most optimistic projections. Not only had it convinced Germany that Calais was the target, it had maintained that conviction even after the Normandy landings began. German forces remained positioned at Calais for weeks after D-Day, still believing a second larger invasion would arrive there. Allied planners continued feeding false information through double agents well into July, sustaining the deception long enough to prevent timely German reinforcement of Normandy. The post-war analysis of German intelligence failures filled volumes. Allied interrogators questioned captured intelligence officers, trying to understand how an apparently sophisticated intelligence apparatus had been so thoroughly deceived. The answers revealed a system that collected information effectively, but processed it through ideological filters that made accurate assessment impossible. German intelligence had not failed to gather information about Allied invasion plans. It had failed to believe information that contradicted Hitler's strategic vision. This distinction mattered. Technical intelligence capabilities, aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts, photo interpretation, had functioned adequately. The failure occurred at the analytical and command levels, where information was evaluated not by its accuracy, but by its political acceptability. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Intelligence scholars studying the Normandy case identified it as a textbook example of how authoritarian systems corrupt intelligence processes. When decision-makers punish bearers of unwelcome news, intelligence organizations learn to provide welcome falsehoods instead of uncomfortable truths. When ideological certainty trumps empirical evidence, the entire intelligence cycle becomes worthless regardless of collection capabilities. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out from Normandy and began the race across France, the intelligence failure's strategic consequences were undeniable. Germany had positioned its strongest forces to defend against a threat that existed only in fabricated reports and Hitler's imagination. The actual invasion had succeeded in part because accurate intelligence had been systematically dismissed as defeatist propaganda. The panzer divisions that could have counterattacked on D-Day were instead committed piecemeal over subsequent weeks, fed into a meat grinder that destroyed them without achieving decisive results. The 15th Army's divisions, which could have created defensive depth in Normandy, instead guarded empty beaches at Calais until long after the battle was lost. The cost could be measured in divisions destroyed, territory lost, and ultimately in the acceleration of Germany's defeat. While it is impossible to say whether different dispositions would have stopped the invasion, Allied material superiority was overwhelming. The historical record shows that Germany's forces were positioned in the worst possible configuration because intelligence that could have informed better decisions was rejected on ideological grounds. In the final accounting, the intelligence officers who warned about Normandy were vindicated by history, if not by their superiors. Their reports had been accurate. Their predictions had been precise, and they had been ignored because in Nazi Germany, telling the Führer he was wrong was more dangerous than letting him lead the nation to disaster. Thanks for watching.